Hey, Mr. Dean. Good evening, everybody. Whoa, boy, that was nice, but we're going to try that again. Cory Booker came all this way from Newark, New Jersey, like the heart of darkness, to come up here, and so we have to make him feel welcome. So good evening, everybody. Good evening. Let's give it up to Cory Booker. Thank you, buddy. Cory and I are dear friends, so when I asked him, we had dinner at a friend's house in New York last spring, and I said, look, I want you to come up and talk at Harvard, and he said he would love to, and so I called Bill, and so this is a joint venture from the Institute of Politics and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research, the finest black research institute in the world. Now, I had prepared a long introduction for Cory, and then about a half hour ago, I got this notice from Bill saying there was an undergraduate who really wanted the right and the pleasure and the privilege of introducing him. So I told him, tell him to kiss off. Hey, this is my show, you can't do it. No, I said, I would be delighted. And so it was a sweet thing, Bill, for you to do. And so I am here, not as I thought an hour ago, to introduce Cory Booker, but to introduce Jarrett Jaffrin. Jarrett Jaffrin, ladies and gentlemen, is a sophomore here at Harvard, a social studies concentrator, and he's from Demorest, New Jersey. And Jarrett attended Cory Booker's rival high school, Northern Valley Regional High School. And he had the great honor of meeting Mr. Booker twice, once when he spoke at his high school, and then at the 2004 Democratic National Convention right here in Boston. And since arriving at Harvard, Jarrett has organized showings of the documentary, which many of us have seen. How many of you have seen Street Fight? And if you haven't seen it, you should buy it. It's on DVD. He's organized screenings of Street Fight, which is about Cory's 2002 mayoral race. And he has constantly pushed Bill to bring Mayor Booker to speak here at the forum. When I was a sophomore at Yale, I don't think I could have addressed an audience this large, and look at all the poise and elegance this man has. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Jarrett Jaffrin to the podium.
Thank you very much, Professor Gates. I think you took all the introduction tonight. I don't know. I can't live up to that one. But good evening, and thank you all for joining us here at the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum for what should be a wonderful night. After his unsuccessful bid for mayor in 2002, Mr. Booker came and spoke at my school. He told us that he grew up in the next town, that his parents needed to have a white couple buy their house for them because of racism. He told us of how after Stanford, but before Yale Law, he became the president of a Jewish organization while on Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford. But more importantly, he told us of how he returned. He moved to the roughest area in Newark, and he brought hope to the neighborhood. He told us of his hunger strike, of living in a tent on the street amidst the drug dealers. To say we all found his idealism inspiring would be an understatement. After that day, I learned more about the mayor. I found out he was a Trekkie. I found out that some of his biggest supporters included New York Knicks forward and former New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley, the incomparable Oprah Winfrey, and the famous linguist Yogi Berra. I found out he had been compared with Harold Ford Jr., Arthur Davis, and Barack Obama. And while I was commuting to Newark via Turnpike Exit 15E, and I promise there is more to New Jersey than the Turnpike, to work for Senator Lautenberg in the revitalized downtown area, Mr. Booker was using his nonprofit Newark Now to address the deep-seated issues that visitors like me don't often see. That summer there was a shooting at Wequahic High School. The school that graduated Philip Roth was now lucky if it kept its students alive. The next time I met Mayor Booker was during the 2004 Democratic National Convention here in Boston at the Black Rose Pub. When I spoke with him, he looked me in the eye and really listened to me, unlike most of the congressmen milling about. I was amazed by his genuine interest, and it is only fitting that he is now here at the Institute of Politics, a place that believes that politics is a noble profession and whose mission is to give students face time with great public figures. Now that he's mayor, Cory Booker has used those same listening skills to hold open court with Newarkers and enact real change. He has been so dynamic in his short tenure in Newark that he's received death threats from the Bloods. When gangs get scared, you know you're doing something right. Since arriving here at Harvard, I continued to follow his career, showed the documentary, and pushed Bill White to bring him here. And it is an honor to finally have him here, and I am proud to be able to call him Mayor Booker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm a former football player at Stanford, and I was on the offensive side of the ball, so staying stationary gets me all scared. I'm afraid somebody usually will hit me, so I like to move around a little bit. It's the best words I've ever had said about me by somebody from Demarest, from a Norseman, so I appreciate that. And but you did not mention to let everybody know that I am clean and articulate as well. It's fantastic to be here. And I appreciate the chance to talk about politics, but after being this a year, I think my friend is correct that politics comes from the Greek word poly meaning many and ticks meaning blood-sucking vermin. So it's been an interesting road for me, and I think if you took me back literally a decade and told me that my life would end up in electoral politics at this point, I would have been shocked and surprised. My life has taken some crazy turns and twists. And what I'd love to do is I'm told that I should talk for only 20 minutes and then we'd open it up for an even longer period of give and take. And I'm hoping that this will become a dialogue and you'll question me about a lot of the policies I'm pursuing, a lot of the specifics of our program and our plan. But I'd like to maybe just put sort of more spiritual thoughts out there to let you know what drives me and what sustains me and what my vision of my country is at this what I think is a crucial turning point in our nation's history. So I began as a law student. I was a law student at a New Haven University, which I will not mention right now. You outnumber me. And I decided that I was going to try to pursue my biggest and boldest dream for myself, that I was going to do what I really dreamed of doing, but in many ways was afraid to do. And I made the decision that I was going to move on to the most dangerous street of the city I loved and the community that I really felt drawn to. And I moved on to a street that Chris Rock jokes about. He says, why is it the most violent street in every city is named after the man that stood for nonviolence? And I moved on to Martin Luther King Boulevard in Newark, New Jersey. And I moved there and began to believe that my idealism was a few steps ahead of my sanity. Because in my first month in this street, I witnessed a reality that I had never seen before, even though I'd worked at that point everywhere from East Harlem to East Palo Alto. On Martin Luther King Boulevard, or the Bully as they call it, there was a 24-hour pharmaceutical trade that could have put Rite Aid to shame. They moved pharmaceutical products with such incredible efficiency. The only time you saw white folks and Asian folks on our street was when they were coming to buy drugs. And it happened about 3 shifts a day, 24 hours. I used to watch outside of my window with fascination the way they moved this. In my first month there, I was jogging down the street one morning and found a body bludgeoned to death on my street corner. In my first month there, I would sit in the back of my room. I got a room in a boarding house across the street from some high-rise projects and would see and watch over through my window over into the back of a crack house that was there and watch people, black folks, white folks, Asian folks, Latino folks, coming in rush hour, usually in the morning, and strapping on surgical tubing to inject IV drugs before they went back to work. And in my first month there, I'll never forget, I had my life threatened. I was walking down the street and looked up, and there was a guy who in every way was just like me. It's my size, my race. In every way, we had everything in common. And I said hello to him, and he jumped off of his perch. He looked me in the eye, and he said, I don't know who the blank you are. I don't know where the blank you come from. But if you ever so much as eyeball me again, I'm going to bust a cap in your posterior region. So and you have to say, I'm a former football player in college. I have strength records there, and I looked at this guy really hard, and we stared at each other for a long moment, and I said, okay, and quickly retreated. So this was my image. This was my first introduction to living someplace after living a decade, literally, in institutions of higher learning across the country and overseas. This was my introduction to the Newark that I dreamed of trying to make a difference in, trying to make a change in. And I have to say I was scared and began to realize the night after this guy whose nickname, by the way, and I'm not making this up, his nickname was T-Bone, and I'm a vegetarian, so it's particularly scary to be threatened by a guy like that. The night that this guy threatened my life, I remember sitting in my one-room apartment in this boarding house and just thinking to myself, is this something that I'm really worth dying for? And I remember talking to a friend of mine who lived in Newark who said to me, well, I know that neighborhood, there's one community leader that's legendary there, you've got to find this woman. And I said, okay, and found her name and found that she lived in one of the buildings in the high-rise projects across the street. And I went to find her and went up 5 flights of stairs, knocked on this door, and I heard this booming voice come out, who is it? And I said, it's Cory Booker. And the door swung open, and I'm looking up, but there was this 5-foot-tall woman, 4'11" woman, and she had her arm crossed, and she said, well, who are you? And I said, in my arrogance, and I said, ma'am, I'm a Yale law student. My name is Cory Booker, and I'm here to help you. and she looks at me like the insane individual I was at the time. And she said, you want to help me? I said, yes. I'm from Yale Law School. I'll be a lawyer soon. I'm living in the neighborhood now, and I figure I could be of some service to you, ma'am. And she'll never forget this. She pushes right past me, and she says, do you want to help me? Follow me. She walks me down 5 flights of stairs, and she walks me into the lobby of the building, through the drug dealers, at which point I'm standing very close to her, into the street, into the middle of Martin Luther King Boulevard, and she swings around, and she says to me, well, if you want to help me, tell me what you see here. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, describe your neighborhood. And I looked around and I said, well, I see a crack house, I see the projects, I see graffiti, I see some drug dealers, which I said in a low and respectful tone, and just sort of describe the neighborhood. And this woman crosses her arms and just shakes her head. She says, you could never help me. And she started walking away from me. And I ran after this woman and I grabbed her from behind. I said, stop, stop. I said, what are you talking about? And she said something so profound to me. She turned around and she looked me deep in the eyes. And she said, boy, she said, you need to understand something. That the world you see outside of you is a reflection of what you have inside of you. And if you're one of those people who only sees problems and darkness and despair, that's all there's ever going to be. But if you're one of those people who sees opportunity, who sees hope, who sees possibility, who sees love, or even the face of God, then you can be somebody that helps me. And she turns around and walked away, just leaving me standing there and her words echoing in my mind. And I'll never forget, I stood there awkwardly for a few minutes, went back to my apartment, and just sat and began to realize that the power and the dignity of the people that lived in this community were going to be my greatest lessons in life. And I went back to Miss Jones's apartment and knocked on the door and began to sit in her apartment while still taking classes at Yale. I began to think that I got my BA at Stanford, but really was doing my PhD work in this woman's living room. And she sat and talked to me about the history of that neighborhood and about her experiences and her frustrations, her pain, her anguish, but more importantly, about the genius that she possessed, which was a vision of herself, a vision of her kids, a vision of her community, and a vision of this country that was so profoundly stirring that I began to see her and many of the women that would come in and out of her apartment as some of the most powerful American heroes I would ever have the chance to work with. And we began to work in this little apartment, hatching plans, and eventually in a community room, about how we can do something about this neighborhood. And they inspired me, and they continued, and they persisted, and they told me how they'd held this community together, the things they used to do, from just even around this time of year, St. Patrick's Day. They'd have St. Patrick's Day celebrations for the kids, and there weren't any Irish living there. And they would pool their pennies together, send kids on field trips, visits to museums. It was amazing what they were doing, and we began to talk about ways to expand it and to take on the challenges. And in a very short period of time, leading before I even ran for my first political office, I participated in probably some of the most fulfilling work of my life. And in that year and a half or so, we were able to make radical change. And really, I witnessed the radical change that was brought about by the enduring prophetic love of this community. We were able to get the slumlord convicted in federal court who owned those buildings. We started going after him in creative protests. I explained a lot of the laws about the HUD-regulated buildings and what was responsible. We started getting more people together, and eventually we did something called blitz calling, where we had over 100 of the residents call the HUD mid-level bureaucrat that was in charge of those buildings, call them over and over and over again, just explaining to them what they were doing wrong. And before you knew it, you had white people in suits showing up to this neighborhood, not to buy drugs, but to come in and start answering to the residents. Eventually, not only was the slumlord convicted in federal court, but the drug dealers eventually left. Some of them we were able to reach out to and get involved in different things. Eventually, we were able to get the crack house on the corner torn down. Prudential, the major corporation in Newark, eventually adopted Quitman Street School, which was a school that sat in the shadows of these projects. All of things happening because of this prophetic vision, because of this enduring faith in a democracy that at its very founding was about the subjugation of darker peoples. It was this belief in America and this demand that this country would be real for everyone. It was a deepening of the democratic principles that I had studied and wrote routine, but were brought to life for me before my eyes in Americans that were committed to this struggle and to these ideals. And it was around this time that I began to see that this government, in many ways, which was celebrated in the 1970s, which had one of the first ever African-American mayors elected. This government that took the civil rights movement in many ways, which blended into the black political movement in that city. This government, which in many ways had the allegiance and had the rhetoric of the civil rights movement still constantly being heard by its leaders, that this government was in many ways a block, a dam towards progressive change in our community. And it was frustrating to me, and it was frustrating to the leaders, and some realities of politics. We found out that the slumlord that we were going after was not, we thought, and we believed, that was not being vigilantly worked against because he was a very large campaign contributor to some of the local politicians. And it began this political consciousness of me, of a person that in many ways shunned politics and wanted to be a social activist, but the thought of elected office was distant from me, to beginning to come to the slow conclusion that it is in the political realm where change, in my community at least, could have been made as radically and quickly. And I eventually turned into a campaign where I was lambasted by a city councilman who I was running against as a tool of the right-wing conspiracy, as white people coming trying to take over Newark. Every kind of sort of race-based demagogic epithet that could be strewn at me was strewn. We had windows of our cars smashed, tires slashed, hate literature coming up against us. But we persevered by doing something that was the most grassroots of grassroots politics. Me and a group of about 10 people knocked on tens of thousands of doors in the city of Newark, in the poorest places, and we were able to have one-on-one conversations with people, feel them, meet them where they are, not with the arrogance in which I first encountered Miss Jones, but talking to people about the simple fact that we as Americans did not deserve what we were living in, and we could claim for ourselves much of what this country stood for. And we ended up increasing the voter turnout in our city back in '98 by about 50% in this one political contest, and sweeping a long-term, four-term incumbent, 40 years my senior, out of office. And I entered City Hall to what became one of the darkest years of my life, because I got in City Hall with this incredible ambition, this incredible idealism, this belief that we could transform the world and hit a brick wall. In fact, I wish it was just a brick wall, but I hit a wall that began to throw bricks back at me. I was a threat to the democracy. I was a threat to what was going on in City Hall. And what I began to find out was that the paradigm that we are now, as mayor, is trying to shift was deeply rooted. And in many ways, it had a very understandable origin. You have to understand what happened historically in America is that we had wave of immigrants coming into our country at a time that the cities did offer avenues towards success and avenues towards the middle class. Newark, New Jersey, as I know I have one friend from the city here in this room, Newark, New Jersey, if you go and scan our city, you see these dinosaurs, these empty skeletons of old factories of the past which used to employ people. Some of the elders in my community who still teach me to this day tell me about them raising their children on the salaries that were being paid. But as we all know, the manufacturing base in the Northeast disappeared just at the time that the black northern migration was pouring into American cities. And as a result of that, suddenly people began to get trapped in the inner city communities. And the economy started spiraling out of control. And poverty started being the lay of the land. And many people started leaving inner city communities, eased by many federal programs, FHA loans, or the Eisenhower Highway Act, but yet at the same time, dealing with redlining and disinvestment in inner city communities that trapped many African Americans there. It was around this time, scanning over history in a quick way, that many of the black politicians came to be. People like Ken Gibson, one of the first ones elected in our city, and eventually Sharp James, who spanned about 30, 40 years of Newark political life. And what made their machine so strong is at a time that there was much hopelessness, that many African Americans were facing the frustrations of joblessness, of deteriorating housing, of bad social policy, of warehousing poor people in these large projects. At that same time, many black politicians began to design government that would ensure the perpetuation of their political power. Many of the machines of the Irish or the Italian were inherited by African Americans. In many ways, they continue that same pattern. And there in Newark, our government became a government that was focused not necessarily on the high ideals, a housing authority that's mission was to provide safe, decent, affordable housing, or school system that was supposed to educate the future leaders of our country. Many of these institutions, like City Hall, became more about jobs, more about streams of patronage, and more about power. We used to joke when we were in City Hall, as we were facing this wall that threw bricks back, we began to realize that we were threatening a very way of life for an entire class of elites in our city that were enjoying untold wealth and opportunity, in our opinion, at the expense of the majority. And we began to see that they were throwing bricks back hard. When I was a city councilman, I had my car ticketed everywhere I parked in the city. My employees, I had 5 of them, wouldn't get their salaries. I'd have to pay them off of, out of my own pocket or off my credit card. I even had my phone tapped by the municipal police. It claimed it was just an honest mistake, but we were able to expose it. Constantly, we began to realize that change was not going to come easily, that change necessitated an incredible sacrifice. And as was mentioned by my Northern Valley colleague here, we began, after a year of being frustrated and getting nothing done, of proposing simple, pragmatic approaches, things like creating performance measures or management indicators, by creating activity-based costing, transforming our budgeting. All these things that we started seeing in the late 1990s pop up in other cities were resisted here because, unfortunately, the system that was designed perfectly for politics. I could be in a corner of the city, way in the East Ward, walk into a public facility, and that information would flow so quickly back to the mayor that they would know exactly what they do. In fact, I got kicked out of more recreation centers, public parks than you can imagine by the mayor who was protecting his base and his power. But yet, at the same time, if you wanted to get basic social services addressed, they would not be addressed. As I spoke earlier today to a group just talking about the lead paint problem that was happening in the late 1990s. And you had children with incredibly high elevated lead levels in our city. And the very institution that was supposed to be doing something about dealing with that problem had a problem even training people that could properly abate lead houses. So there's all of these things that you would expect government to do with the same kind of efficiency, the same kind of ferocious urgency as they were dealing with politics, but it was not happening. And we were trying to make change. And much of the change, though, was a spiritual change, was trying to get people to claim that spirit that Ms. Jones and so many other leaders were injecting in me at a time and making me feel so much more loyal to my country than I'd ever been before, not because of its seminal texts, not because of the Constitution. As Stokely Carmichael used to always say, constitute. I can only say 3/5 of that word. But because of the spirit of which this nation stood for. One of the things we decided to do, I'll never forget, as I was coming home, and was mentioned by my hometown friend, as I was coming home one night after one of the most frustrating times in that first year, I came home to Miss Jones, and she was standing in front of the buildings, and she said, "Boy, what's going on?" I said, "Oh, I've had a horrible day. There was a violent incident up at some projects in the northern part of the ward I represent. The mayor made it clear that I'm an administrator and a legislator. I can't even get 4 votes to do anything, and then I can't even get the police out there to do something about it. And I'm just frustrated. I don't know what I should do." And Miss Jones, who is the honorary, toughest, pain in my neck you can imagine, she looks at me, she goes, "Well, I know what you should do, boy." And I'm like, "What should I do?" She goes, "I know what you should do." And I said, "Well, Miss Jones, what should I do?" I know what you should do, boy." And I'm like, "Miss Jones, what should I do?" And she goes, "You should do something." And I'm like, "Do something?" And she says, "Yeah, you should do something." And lo and behold, after sitting in my room for a second, I was sitting there in meditation and eventually opened up one of our seminal texts, the Bible, and there was a passage by Matthew about the faith of the size of the mustard seed, and after it said something about, but sometimes you have to fast and pray, and I decided that I would get a tent out there with another Science High graduate, a friend of mine. We went out to Garden Spires, these projects. We set up a tent, and we declared that we were going to go on a hunger strike until somebody did something about this. And it was this amazing experience where I finally felt like I tapped into that which makes our country so profoundly powerful. We stood out there for the first night, and it was scary. The drug dealers who we had told were unarmed, we're not going to fight them, but we're not going to leave until they stop what they're doing. They threw everything from food to feces on top of the tent, and we sat in fear, and they played loud music. Fortunately, I like Biggie Small and Tupac, but the next morning, the media came out and they said, "What are you doing out here? What are you doing out here?" And I said, "This is the United States of America. People should not have to live in terror within our own communities." And I said, "I challenge you to interview the people that live here, who have dignity, who play by the rules, who are reflections of the divine. Interview them about their life and put that on your morning news." And they put it on the morning news. And before you knew it, within a couple of hours, the first people to show up were these big hulking African-American men from a local correctional facility. And they just said to me, "Look, we're not going to let you sit out here alone. We're going to stand out here with you." And by the end of that day, there were dozens of people coming from all corners of the city of Newark and said that this is our city. We're not going to let it be taken over. And within a few more days, you had businesses coming out. The mayor of a suburban wealthy town sent his police officers down. You had hospitals coming out and doing health screenings. You had churches and mosques coming out to pitch in. You had businesses coming out to donate computers to a learning center in the buildings. You had NYU students coming out to sleep with me under the tent. It was amazing transformation. And I'll never forget, as we stood there praying at the last day, there was 4 of us in the beginning just praying and shaking. By the end of it, there's hundreds of people holding hands, black, white, Jewish, Latina, Muslim, praying and holding hands. And it's finally, I began to hear some of those ideals of our nation, of what we are supposed to be about, what we are supposed to stand for. Hearing things that Martin Luther King said in the letters from the Birmingham jail, we are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a common garment of destiny, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we persisted after that, and we began to try to get the understanding to the rest of our team and to other people in the city that the government that we have is always will be a reflection of who we are at our core. And if we want a different result, we have to be willing to try and engage in different things. We have to be willing to challenge the very ideas and the very paradigms in which we are now trapped. The very essence of our government, if it's not satisfactory, we have to push to make changes. And we took on sacred cows. We took on the teachers union by talking openly about education reform and picked enemies with people that we didn't anticipate but came at us with a ferocity, beginning to try to challenge people about why are these educational institutions in Newark succeeding and these other ones, the majority of them, that are spending up to $17,000, $18,000 a year to educate children, why are they failing? Let's talk about some of the basic assumptions we have with education. Why is this idea that time should be the constant for children and achievement be the variable? Why is that the way we orient ourselves? Of having kids go to school the same hours in a day, the same days in a week, the same amount of days for a year, and having achievement all over the place? Why don't we look at some of the incredible charter schools in our city that have decided that they were going to have achievement be the constant and time be the variable, with kids now coming in for Saturday schools, kids going to school more hours in a day, kids going to school more hours in a year? Why are they taking kids that are 3 grade levels below the district average and then graduating all of them and have them go into college? There are obvious avenues that innovative people are showing and demonstrating that can make a substantial difference in our country. But yet we are failing to embrace it or pursue it with great alacrity, pursue it with great urgency, pursue it with all of our essence and all of our soul. And we started fighting that battle and speaking as articulately as possible to our own community about making a different choice. That here we stand in the age of information technology, and in front of City Hall is a line to just pay your dagnab parking ticket that wraps around City Hall, that by the time you go through there, by the time you navigate the Byzantine Labyrinth just to pay your parking ticket, you get back to your car and your meters run out and you got another ticket. It made no sense that if I can go online and pay and buy a car in 10, 20, 30 minutes off of Saturn's website or what have you, that we can in the city of Newark start engaging in new information and new technology. We began to challenge the status quo and speak truth to power, and it had a scary, again, reaction, because power would concede nothing unless we were going to be willing to demand and fight for it. And we took on in 2002 an experience that I never even imagined. I underestimated the ferocity with which that election would come. It became this Oscar-nominated movie, and the great filmmaker only captured, and to me, it's still a fraction of the brutality we faced, as I watched people who believed in me and believed in themselves and had a vision for their city, as I watched them face the firings from their job, losing their health insurance, as I watched people have their businesses shut down by code enforcement officials, as I watched police officers intimidate them, as I saw more people have cars damaged, vandalism, sugar poured in their tank, as we saw this constantly happening that beat us down, as I watched my parents, who were part of the civil rights movement, part of the reason I am who I am, watch other leaders say that I'm not black, watch other leaders that say I'm an insult to my race, watch other leaders say that I am a tool of whomever you choose, a tool of the Jews, a tool of the right wing, a tool of all this. As I joked earlier, I should have had a hardware shop. I had so many tools. As I watched the demagoguery, as I watched the appeals to racial piety and not a real racial reasoning that would produce results, as I watched a frustrating core stream within African American politics, but frankly within politics as usual, where people appeal to the lowest common denominator, appeal to people's fears, appeal to our divisions, as opposed to appeal to our highest ideals and visions of ourselves. And we fought and we lost. And at the end of that, there was no turning back. Watching so many people in my city choose a different direction despite the odds, we continued our fight. And so now here I am, a mayor of Newark, New Jersey, the largest city in our state. We finally fought and we finally persevered and we prevailed. And now we have a very difficult job, and I want to be frank with you. We walked into City Hall and the situation was far worse than we imagined. We have a city that is hemorrhaging dollars, that is in financial freefall, that has close between $120 and $170 million budget deficit off of a $700 million budget. Watch a city that has no internal controls, no systems of accountability. Every rock we look under, the city was losing money or creating severe and serious liabilities. And I see the core of it. The core of it was because we were stuck. I go to that court system finally. Now I'm mayor of the city, and I walk into that court system and say, to figure out why the heck there is this long line outside. And I see the court administrator early that morning telling people where to go. Okay, you're here, go there. You're here, there, go there. I'm like, why don't people come in with a specific job to do? I don't understand this, I said to her. And she said, well, why don't people come to the specific job, Corey? Because, Mr. Mayor, because I don't know who's going to show up in the morning. And I'm like, you don't know who's going to show up? These are people's jobs. Why don't everybody show up? And she goes, oh, we have a terrible absentee problem. Well, why don't you sanction people? Why don't you discipline people? And she's like, I can do that, Mr. Mayor? And I'm like, yes, you can. Well, she proceeds to tell me that in the previous administration, if you wanted to discipline somebody, if you wanted to sanction somebody, you wrote their names on a list and sent them to the mayor's office. And inevitably, the mayor would come back and say, you can't discipline any of these people because of who they know, not what they know, because of their connections. And this was how our government has operated for a long time, undermining reform, undermining change, and creating perverted systems that just don't serve people, but serve to perpetuate political power. And now this is the cause. We've been in it 8 months, and we are trying to make those changes. And it's frustrating, and it's hard, and there are very, very difficult days. But I see hope, and I see opportunity. I see how simple policies we've been engaging in already are leading to a tremendous change. Already in 8 months, we've driven the numbers of shootings down in our city. The last 2 months alone, over 30% less people being killed. We're finding opportunities where there wasn't before, even if we don't have money. We're reaching out and creating public-private partnerships that are resulting in substantive opportunities for people. But I want to wrap this up to let you know that it is not an easy road. If we are not satisfied with the status quo, it necessitates change, and change by its very nature is incredibly difficult. Frederick Douglass said, those who profess to favor freedom yet deprecate agitation are like those who want the crops without the tilling of soil. That power concedes nothing without a demand, that it takes sacrifice and it takes work. I'll end by simply saying another story where I started with Miss Jones. And this woman is this ubiquitous presence in my life, and it is difficult. And I was, a little while back, walking in my neighborhood, and this was before I was mayor, and gunshots rang out. And I looked up on a hill between two sort of housing complexes, echoing like cannon, this gunfire. And kids started streaming down the hill as I stood there. And then suddenly, I felt called to sprint up the hill through the kids towards the gunfire. And I get to these steps just as this child is stumbling backwards. And I catch him in my arms. I look over his chest, and I see this white T-shirt he was wearing filling up with this red, deep blood. And I lay him on the ground on my lap and just sat there screaming at people to call an ambulance, throwing my hands into this bloody child's chest, screaming for people to call an ambulance. And asked for his name. His name was Wazin Miller. And just praying, asking Wazin to stay with me. His eyes rolled back in his head. He started gagging and coughing up the foamy red blood. And then he fell still. I still desperately just tried to stop the blood from wherever it was coming, and he just kept foaming at the mouth as I reached my hand into his mouth, trying to clear a passageway. I felt for a pulse. There was nothing. Screaming in his ear, Wazin, stay with me. Wazin, stay with me. The cops came and shoved me out of the way, and the ambulance rather, and ripped open his chest, and there I saw 3 bullet holes in his front and 1 in his side. And I watched numbly as they desperately tried to work to save this child, and they could not do anything. I went home that night, and after standing there answering, and looked at myself in the mirror, and I gave in. I just put my hands in the sink and just tried to scrub this child's blood off of my hand, and the blood would not leave my hand. Even when the evidence of it was gone, I just felt like the blood would not leave my hand, and I began weeping in the sink, tears of rage, of hopelessness. I indulged in that sense of impossibility that began to blacken my heart. And I feel like, what is this all about? That children are dying in my city at rates that are unconscionable, that rates 1 generation ago would have caused a national outrage, but children keep dying. And what is my country that seems to be obsessed in a perverse manner with women with the name of Natalie Holloway or JonBenet Ramsey? And here's a child, Wazin Miller, that nobody will ever freaking know his name. Why am I living in a nation where a black child has such a different experience than a white child? That in the New York Times reports that an average black 12th grader leads at the same level as the average white 8th grader. Why, 40 years from Brown versus Board of Education, the sacrifice that I saw my forefathers and mothers put, why are we still living in this result? And I grew angry, and I grew frustrated, and I grew tired and sick, and just wanted to go away and run and hide and give in and give up. And I went to bed that night in a fitful manner, woke up the next morning, I came downstairs, and as I walked out into the courtyard before anybody was awake in front of the 2 buildings in Brick Towers where I lived, I saw the back of that woman's head, Miss Jones. And it was enough to sort of stap me, and I stood there, and there in the middle of me somewhere, was that indelible light of the human spirit that is in all of us. And suddenly it went on. And I looked at this woman, and in an exasperated way, I just stood and looked at the back of her head and smiled. And why? Because I remembered that this woman, this incredible woman, years earlier told me a story about her son, who put on the uniform of these United States of America and served for our country in a land far away that he probably never even read about. Came home to visit his mama at home. And Miss Jones said that she got a knock on her door. Her door opened up. She was dragged by somebody down those 5 flights of stairs into the lobby where her son was on his back, bleeding the lobby floor red. She said she wailed out and fell to her knees and cried into her dead son's body, murdered in the lobby of Brick Towers. And I remember when she told me this, and this is what I was recalling when I stood there just looking at the back of her head. I said to her, the stupid things that come to people's minds when you hear stories of untold tragedy. I said to her, I said, Miss Jones, I said, I know where you work. She and I were 2 of the people that paid market rent to live in these Brick Towers. I said, I know where you work. I know the money you make. I said, why do you still live here in Brick Towers? And this woman crossed her arms and looked at me, and she said, why do I still live in Brick Towers? I said, yes, Miss Jones. Why do I still live here in these buildings? Yes, Miss Jones. She goes, why am I still in apartment 5A? I said, yes, Miss Jones. And she stuck out her chest, and she looked at me with a determination I will never forget. And she said, because I'm in charge of Homeland Security. We are Americans. We are the inheritors of a legacy of untold struggle. We are the ones who have taken a baton and are still listening to children in the mornings. One nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all. We're listening to words that not are, but are aspirational. We are seeing the unfinished business of what this country is supposed to stand for. Langston Hughes said, there's a dream in this land with its back against the wall. To save the dream for one, we must save the dream for all. And here this old woman, this old difficult woman, seem to understand a view of history, going back to Jerusalem in the year 6970, or the Roman Empire in the year 476, or the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, all of whom empires who've fallen. She understood the historical fact that no great empires failed simply because of external threats. They fail because of internal corruption, because of their inability to live up to the ideals that they profess. We're not the only nation that was conceived in incredible ideals. But I believe that the American spirit has a chance to be one of those first nations that makes real on that promise for all of its citizens. I end with a paraphrase of a quote of my favorite book, Beyond Religious Texts. And it is a book that is by an author who wrote it in 1963, a book called The Fire Next Time. And Baldwin writes a difficult book with a poignant truth. But he ends it with words that to me are prophetic, are in fact calls to that prophetic vision that what our nation was at its founding and at every step as we've lurched and dragged and pushed this nation forward. At the end of his book, he says quite powerfully, he says, I know what I'm asking you is impossible. But in today's day and age, the impossible is the least we can demand. And one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general and Negro history in particular, because it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. And if we, and by we, I mean the truly conscious blacks and the truly conscious whites who must, like lovers, come together and create and insist upon the consciousness of it all, if we are now willing to make the sacrifice to dare it all, we may be able to avoid the tragedy. We may be able to avoid the Bible prophecy made real in the Negro spiritual. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. I tell you this, the fires of my city will burn again, but they will not be the fires of rage and alienation, of riot and rebellion. They will be the fires of hope, of opportunity, the fires of love, the fires of the divine, the fires of the American torch itself. I believe that today. I believe that every day. It is what sustains me. It's what empowers me. It's what helps me continue to go forward. And I feel that energy from you, and I'm grateful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wow, Brock better stop worrying about Hillary. No, I know you're friends with Brock. Now it's time for Q&A. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you very much.
Man, I'm going to give you a donation. I'm going to move to Newark, but I'm not going to live in your tenement. I ain't going to do that. You're living there for both of us. Noah, how you doing, buddy?
Good.
Now, you all know the deal. There's a microphone up there. There's one there. Bill, where's the other? Oh, right over your head? So the 3 microphones. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes. So, and when we don't want any speeches. We want questions. And I will cut you off. Noah, you're first.
I went to high school in New Jersey, and I want to say Frank Lautenberg is going to retire pretty soon. And I know you've got a lot on your plate right now, but how do you feel about being our next senator?
That's a very flattering question, but the real question I you is where's the most important fight right now? And there are a lot of senators. I watched the debate when John Corzine was running, and there was another a Democrat, I can't remember, and they polled them on all the major issues and how they would vote, and they all voted the exact same way. And I just think that for me, my calling right now is the fight in my community in Newark. And I think that the inner cities, as Ms. Jones would say, are or would intimate that the inner cities are one of the last frontiers of the fight for America. And I think I can make a much bigger difference there.
That means that yes, after he's been reelected. Yeah. Yes, and then you.
Certainly. Hi, my name is Jacqueline Greer, and I'm an MPP2 here at the Kennedy School. And you mentioned some of the education reforms
Yes.
that you're working on in Newark, and education is often referred to as the next civil rights issue of our time. I want to know what you're working on and what the next direction is for your city and what your goal is for all of the students in Newark.
In 5 words or less? Or?
Big question, yeah.
I will, just real quick, let me just talk about my party, the Democratic Party. And you would expect my party to be the one of innovation and embracing reform and change and experimentation. And we who are of the sort of the post-soul generation, as Eddie Glaude would say, the post-civil rights movement generation, we who music and hip hop is all about sampling the old, remembering where we came from, but innovating on the new and bringing forth different ideas and different expressions of our own unique experience in this time. So you would think that our generation would be moving towards educational innovation. I'm so psyched to see it happening. But I told the story earlier today in a class about me being in line. I was on the platform committee for the Democratic Party and saw language in there that I thought was anti-charter and anti-scholarship, anti-voucher, as some people might call. And I turned around to the woman standing next to me, an attractive woman, and I've been known to flirt before.
You?
Yes. And I said to her, where are you from, yada, yada. And she said that she was with the National Teachers Union and that she was here staffing other delegates. And I couldn't believe when she told me how many delegates they had on this platform committee. And here I was going to put something in to defend charters and stuff like that. Basically, I didn't get her phone number. But the reality is my strong belief right now is in Newark we have such an opportunity to create real reform, substantive reform. And it will be in a number of different ways that I'm hoping to push. One is reforming the public schools from within and some of these basic rules that I think that undermine achievement and some of the same corruption that I'm encountering in public schools. You know, we have a phenomenal school leader right now. She has an authentic love for the people of the city of Newark that I think is inspiring. But the reality is that we are not embracing reform. So we think in my team that we've got to start squeezing the bureaucracy. We have between $17,000 and $18,000 per child to educate our kids, and not much of it's going to the classroom. We've got to start creating more resources available to school leaders, better training for school leaders.
Where does it go, Corey? Where does the money go?
I think the same way it's going to my cities. Why are my city residents paying the taxes they're paying? A lot of it's being eaten up by the bureaucracy and not in service. And I think we should be pushing more down. But that's just one area I can go on ad nauseum about that. The second thing, though, is expanding charter schools in my city. We have some of the best charter school providers in the nation. New York Times Magazine did a special about these charter school clusters. We have a KIPP Academy. Some of you all are familiar with KIPP. We have another group called Uncommon Schools. They have schools that are outperforming wealthy suburbs in New Jersey. And we're now talking about expanding those charter schools such that we have 20%, 30%, 40% of our kids going to proven schools of excellence. And that's one a definite way to do it as well. So I think that with 44,000 kids, we can see a way in which we can transform our school system. And so that right now we have a fraction of the magnet schools than we have the traditional high schools. But our magnet schools altogether graduate more people than our traditional high schools. And the majority of our kids are graduating. The majority of our kids are not graduating from high school by being able to pass the state standard test. We have a crisis, and we need reform and change. And I'm sorry that's such a truncated answer.
No, it's good. Sir.
My name is Ben Bolger, and I'm a grad student at the Harvard Design School. And my question is, I grew up in Flint, Michigan. And if you're familiar with the film Roger and Me, you know that General Motors and other large manufacturing companies moved out of the Midwest and out of Michigan, and really jobs departed,
Yes.
industrial towns like that. And it seems that your city and cities like Flint, Michigan have something in common, that there's a problem in getting jobs to return to these cities. What strategies do you have to make your city more attractive for jobs and employers and help to revitalize the city?
So a whole bunch of ideas that we have, so I'm going to take just 3 real quick to throw at you. So one is we have to understand where our economy is right now. And you can't try to get manufacturers to necessarily come into your city if they're not going to be able to compete in a new global marketplace. So we're looking to find those kind of jobs that we can seize upon that are going to have big impacts for our city. So one of them is just we are actually have the 3rd busiest port in the nation, the 2nd busiest port in terms of value of goods coming into the United States of America. And we see a problem right now. It's an environmental problem, it's an economic problem that a lot of folks used to ship stuff into Newark, put them on trucks, drive them down the New Jersey Turnpike, and around some suburban-ish town, 8A exit, if those of you Jersey people, would put them into big warehouses, break them up, they would work on their supply chain efficiencies, and then most of the time they'd send them back up the turnpike, back into Newark, to put back on ships or to put back on rail. And we're saying that's insane. Why don't you all just build your warehousing here? Actually, sophisticated warehousing is now great jobs. They pay living wages, competitive wages, in fact, and they are not high-skilled jobs. So right now we have a big strategy to go about finding that. And every city has a niche, and it's a matter of finding out what your niche is. And a lot of the niches, educational institutions. We have a great 5, now 6 major colleges and universities in Newark, and a medical establishment. So we're focusing on those jobs and those areas we can leverage and draw more research in. Stem cell research now, we're working with the governor to bring a lot of that into the city of Newark, which has a multiplier effect. Retail, so many places in America, inner cities, are under-retailed. We did an analysis of how many retail dollars leave Newark to shop. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent outside of our city by Newarkers themselves, and we should be not pushing that kind of out. We should be bringing suburbanites into Newark to shop. Two other areas real quick is one is just prisoner reentry. We're focusing on that group, and often the group, there are job opportunities, but they have so many barriers to them getting those jobs. So we're working now on eliminating background checks for jobs that don't necessarily mandate them. We're looking at ways to help them get driver's license and the like. And the last thing I'll say is just in the construction trades. Many unions have been very exclusivist and not letting inner city young people into them to get training, to get skills. So we're finding ways to incentivize both a private sector and the unions to allow people from my community to get jobs. And one of the ways I can do it is with the land that I control. The previous mayor used to give away land at cut-rate discounts to connected individuals, friends, possibly even family members. What we're saying is we'll give you discounted rates if, number one, you'll commit to green building, you'll commit to union work and the like, and then we turn to the unions, and I had a meeting with them last week, saying that if you expand opportunities for apprenticeship programs for my people, for my community, then we'll do it. And we're having great success already working towards that. But we've got some obvious models already. Places like Youth Build, some of you might know about that, which is a phenomenal organization. One of Clinton's People of Hope was the one that started it, which takes at-risk kids, gives them GED training, but also trains them in the construction trades. So we're finding niches that work for our community, and we're looking to pursue them with great determination. And the last thing I'll say, just to make this answer incredibly long, is we're trying to take a mayor that lambasted me, for example, with racial rhetoric. But we get into City Hall and find out that he never did one in the last year's affirmative action inspection to see if those builders who did get city assets actually fulfilled their local hiring requirements, minority hiring requirements. Didn't use one minority set aside. One of the biggest businesses in Newark is government. And here we have all these contracts going out. The overwhelming majority of our city contracts are going to firms outside of our city. Why aren't they going to local firms? Well, local black minority Latino and black companies tell me that they don't have the money, that they don't have the bonding capacity to bid on local contracts. They're too big for them. So we're starting to look at our procurement processes, split up these big contracts into smaller contracts, and allow more local folks to bid on them. And we're trying to make capital available, creating minority loan pools and the like, to get more people opportunities to get access to capital so they can start businesses and start taking advantage of the opportunities that are
Corey,
local.
how do you get people, I presume that people are shopping in shopping malls, or else in Newark, in New York City, right? So how do you get them to shop, to come back downtown?
You've got to create the retail attraction. You're seeing it in Harlem right now, that they're experimenting with a lot of the block stores, inner city, and they're becoming some of the busiest stores there are. We're starting to show it in Newark because we have a supermarket that's one of the busiest of that chain there is. And we were selling it. I'm going to be going out to Vegas in May. Don't feel sorry for me. To pitch a lot of retail people. We had Barry actually was helpful to bringing some retail folks into our city to start selling them on the opportunities. And capital is smart. They're seeing the opportunity. We're beginning to get the interest in Newark.
Okay.
Professor, thank you. That was a perfect segue into my question. Mr. Mayor, you mentioned East Palo Alto in your remarks. I grew up about 7 blocks from what used to be the worst part of East Palo Alto, the city that had the highest per capita murder rate.
Whiskey Gulch there?
Whiskey Gulch.
Yes.
Whiskey Gulch and East Palo Alto in general has undergone a tremendous amount of revitalization, gentrification. Whiskey Gulch now has a Four Seasons, and there's a fancy office complex, there's an IKEA, there's a Best Buy, there's an Office Depot. That's great. That's all great. And I think East Palo Alto is an interesting case study compared to Newark because now there's all this great economic development in East Palo Alto, but yet there's 60% of people don't speak English at home, $13,000 per capita income average. How will Newark, in creating economic development, make sure that economic development just isn't superficial, that the people also benefit from it, and that, I'll leave the question.
No, that's right. And gentrification, people are complaining about in Harlem. Right now, 3 out of every 4 jobs in Newark that are there now are going to people that don't live in our city. So how can you have the indigenous population participate in the wealth, especially in the second poorest city in America right now, which is Newark, one of the poorest city? Yeah, after Cleveland, by per capita income, a city that has the lowest home ownership rate. How do we make sure that the indigenous folks do it? Now, the advantage we have over Harlem is that we had a city that used to be 500,000 people or more that completely depopulated, and now we've got about 285,000 people. So we have a space to draw back a middle class to our city and to draw back downtown retail and a lot that will not necessarily squeeze out our indigenous folks. So we can bring tens of thousands of people back to live in Newark, and we're trying to create a 24-hour downtown right now without necessarily moving people out or pricing people out of the community. We have a major affordable housing push that we're doing right now to make sure that Newark residents can buy in Newark and stay in Newark. We're looking also at tax breaks for long-term residents and the like. But the most important thing is just make sure people can get access to the jobs. So we have, some of you who know New Jersey right now, the previous mayor, I think, sold our city down the river by spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build a hockey arena in downtown Newark. I was furious about it, especially with the settlement he had with our Port Authority, which is a whole different story. But when we walked in, we had very little leverage, and they didn't teach me this in business school about how do you negotiate. I took negotiation classes, but they never taught you how to negotiate when you have no leverage. But we went to the table and said, we're going to fight this. You don't want a mayor of a city fighting this unless you have more minority inclusion, more inclusion of indigenous folks, more inclusion in the ongoing business of there. So this is not something that can be done with one policy stroke. Every step of ground, you have to have leaders that are vigilant in making sure that those who get the benefits of any resurgence are the people that live there. The previous administration's rhetoric was right on line, but they didn't do the simple policy things that could have ensured that there's an empowerment from within. And I think we're going to become a national model for sustainable development that empowers all communities.
Sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Franklin Miller. I class of '94 here.
All right.
But also I'm pursuing an MPP at Tufts right now. So I am a native Newark resident.
All right.
Grew up on Weequahic Ave in the
right.
South Ward. So I had to make it out to this conversation today. My basic question is not a speech, but it is a question of your specific activities, which are meant to develop young black males from where they are to being successful in American society.
Thank you very much. So we have a serious crisis for young black males nationwide. New York Times reported that for young black males that don't graduate from high school, more than will end up in prison than will have full-time jobs. Right. And it's a really serious challenge. So we're looking at it on every single level. So I've already talked about some programs that to me hold excitement, things like Youth Build or apprenticeship programs. Everybody's not going to go to college, but if they can get in the electrical workers union and graduate of their 4 or 5 year apprenticeship program, they're going to be making $90,000, $100,000 a year as an electrical worker. So we're trying to focus on the things that will empower and enrich them, but everything from, I'm doing something called the Mayor's Academic Challenge. I went to all the freshmen this year and tried to say, if you do good in school, these are some of the incentives that you're going to be able to do. To increase after-school programs. We put millions of dollars now at this point into summer job programs for our young people. We're doing a lot of work for kids, young kids that are coming out of the Essex County Youth House. And up until this year, kids were just flowing into that place. It's the biggest and busiest one in the state of New Jersey, and just flowing right, they just released a 13-year-old right back into the community with no guidance, no tracking, not even ensuring that he's going back to school. So we're trying to get reentry programs for those young people, at-risk youth. We're cooperating with mentoring programs, a whole panoply of things that we're trying to do to make sure we deal with this population. And then even on the higher ends, kids that are succeeding in school, and I don't want to paint with a broad brush. We have a huge part of our young black men in our community are doing well, but even then they hit walls with opportunities for scholarships to colleges and opportunities to continue. And we're working very hard with local colleges to begin to give opportunities. In fact, we just worked with a local college, Seton Hall, to give scholarships to Newark kids, about $1 million worth of scholarships to Newark kids to go to our local colleges who qualify.
We're running out of time, so I want to, we can ask 3 questions, Bill, or 4? 4. Quick questions, quick answers.
I know that was coming.
Let's see. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, Mayor Booker. I just want to say that you've been an inspiration to me, and I thank you for your passion that you'd exuded during your speech. My question is, you spoke about the mental change that the mental paradigm shift that needs to occur in order for us to live up to our American ideals. And my question is, what mechanisms do you use to help your constituency and the individuals that you have to work with make those type of paradigm shifts?
And Corey, and would you ask your question too, and they could address them both?
Sure. You talked a little bit about attacking the issue of educating and preparing young black men. One of the problems as a Cleveland resident that we have is seeing a tremendous brain drain of talented individuals going elsewhere. I was wondering what initiatives, if any, are you employing to kind of attract or tap talent back to the city as an avenue for economic development?
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Oh, you want to go those two?
Yeah, those
So the paradigm shift, it's on every level, and you've got to pick your issues. And so let's just talk about one area. It's just the financial practices of inner city communities. And there's a lot of wealth in our community that we all know, that folks check cashing places, making poor financial decisions, instant refunds, which is a usury loan, basically. So we're trying to attract that head on by, number one, talking about it, showing people wide avenues for success. We have free tax preparation in City Hall itself. You walk in, you have free tax preparation. Anytime I meet citizens, I'm talking about how to use the earned income tax credit, which is something we're trying to take our city, stop them from leaving tens of millions of dollars on the table and actually get that back in their pockets. So, but also using education. My nonprofit's holding class, we call them free, Families Realizing Economic Empowerment, and getting people to start thinking that they control their destiny in every way, but especially their financial destiny by the decisions that they're making. And we can't let us slip, as Cornel West says, from the I have a dream generation to the bling bling generation, and getting people to understand how money can work for them. And that's a paradigm shift, in my opinion. As another great leader, John Hope Bryant, says, we need to go from the civil rights movement to the civil rights movement and help our communities understand how to make money work for them. But ultimately, it comes down to being the change you want to see in the world, and we're really trying to manifest that in everything we do from City Hall, even extra-governmentally. The brain drain is a real challenge, and I challenge some of the Newarkers in this room to come back home. But ultimately, you have to make cities competitive. And people who, folk in this room are probably very irrational, and many of them are dedicated to service in a way that I think is a reflection of from whence we've come ancestrally. But many people are just rational economic actors and follow opportunities. And so we are trying to make Newark a competitive city to live in. I'm focusing a lot on driving crime down, and I have strategies for that are reclaiming our black brothers and sisters who are on the streets, or Latino brothers and sisters, or whomever. But also, there's a lot of the traditional things that have shown crime reductions in other cities, and we're having that success because safety, again, attracts people. We're trying to create a diversity of housing, so a big focus on affordable housing, but also we're starting a condo market in the city of Newark and letting people know that you could live in Brooklyn or you can live in Newark. You could have cheaper rent here. You can get into the city a lot quicker, into Manhattan. We're 10 miles away, and so on and so forth. So we're going to make Newark competitive, but I'm also always, everywhere I go, and including this room, I'm trying to inspire people to this idea that we have to participate in the continued revolution that started back at the founding of our country, that's still ongoing. And I invite anybody who's interested in being a part of what we're trying to do in Newark to talk to me or Barry, wave your hand, Barry, afterwards about getting involved.
Yes.
Good evening. The theme this year for the Black Policy Conference held here at the Kennedy School, April 13th and 14th, is Speaking Truth to Power, Informing the Black Legislative Agenda. As a member of the new Black political leadership, what do you think are the top 3 issues that Black Americans must raise in the upcoming election cycle? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. So I would definitely start with education. And what is a real, and I love from Democrats, I really want to hear, don't just give me the same rhetoric that I've been hearing about education for a long time. What is your real plan to make a difference? People are vilifying the No Child Left Behind Act, which has aspects of it that are worth vilifying, but there's actually some aspects of it that were well conceived, or an unfunded mandate. What are their thoughts about things like that? The second issue is public safety, and what investments is the federal government can make. Alternative detention programs, the COPS program, which Clinton put in place that was defunded, all these things that could produce a safer community. And then there's 2 boring things that maybe are not as sexy, but inner city communities, most of us have tremendous budget deficits. We can barely afford infrastructure improvements. You have all these huge transportation bills and the like. Where are those resources going? Are they really going to rebuild infrastructure, which is my competitive advantage to draw industry and investment? Or are they going to, in Alaska, to bridges to nowhere? And then the second one is environmental issues, but how are you casting environmental issues? Are you casting it just as a larger suburban issue, or in a way that that often fails to talk about the urban environmental disasters that we have going on, and what kind of federal funds am I going to have for brownfields cleaning up urban rivers which have been polluted over the years. So this is just a big swath of it. I would also talk about prisoner reentry programs for federal crimes. I can go on and on and on. But I'm really tired of hearing our Democratic politicians in particular, and by the way, great ideas, and I embrace the other side of the aisle because a lot of great ideas, Clinton claimed so much credit for the empowerment zones, but it really was an idea that came from Jack Kemp on the Republican side. So I think that great ideas come from both sides of the aisle. I happen to be the Democratic side because I think we got more of them. But I also am frustrated sometimes by the narrow thinking of my side of the aisle. And really, are they going to be courageous? Being a presidential candidate is not just about trying to appeal to the broadest base of people. It's about having a strong, passionate, urgent vision of where the city can go that often might be stepping on toes, but that ultimately, if you trust in the electorate, will resonate with the common American. And I think we are looking for that kind of authenticity from our presidential candidates.
Final two questions, double-barreled, you and you.
Hello, I'm also from Newark, New Jersey, and I just would like to know about your plans to address the deep-seated issue of the tension between the city residents and the police officers, and also the tension between city residents and city government, okay, and the sense of distrust that exists.
Mm-hmm. And yes, you.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your presence, inspiration, and vision. And then I'd also like to ask if you have tactical advice for those of us at institutions of prestigious education in keeping your grounding and connection to and from your home community.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll go here first, and I have to end with my voter. And her family still votes. Am I beyond pandering? No. You've got to source yourself. I'm not the best example of that. I work sort of crazy hours and probably don't do enough. But wherever you are on your journey and service, you should always find things that source you, that empower you, that ground you, that keep you focused on yourself. I said to another class, my favorite quote by Lincoln, that every man, he was kind of sexist when he said it, but every man is born an original, but sadly most die copies. We've got to do things to preserve our uniqueness, our divinity, our authentic selves, and I try to definitely do that. And valuing friendships and valuing those associations that people that keep you grounded. I have a lot of my friends that still tell me I'm full of baloney when I am, and check me on myself, which is really needed. Omar, who's in this room, and I'll go over here. That's one of my biggest frustrations, and a lot of the distrust and cynicism is well-founded and well-grounded. And let's just take our police department. We are an 80% African-American and Latino city, 80 to 85%. And our police department at the highest levels is all white. And here we've had over 30 years of black leadership. But if you look inside our police department, like I'm doing right now with this phenomenal captain, who's also a Baptist reverend, you find that practices that have worked against black police officers for a long time, from promotions to opportunities for advanced training or discipline, unfair discipline. So you have to, before you can create a perception, you have to create a reality that backs it up. And so we're not dodging the realities that are going on. And so if I'm a young black kid, and when I was out in East Palo Alto, I had cops surround my car, guns drawn, accused of stealing things, and so on and so forth. And we know that goes on in Newark, I'll be frank with you. So we've got to deal with it on the front end, and I'm trying to be very aggressive in building that trust. It's tough to build that trust with the government as well, and that's why I'm trying to be so much out there, to try to be incredibly accessible, whether it's through office hours and tell people if you want to see me, you can have a chance to see me, to being around the community. But it's tough, and I meet people all the time who are grateful and see the difference already we're making in crime, but I meet people who are good people who don't know me for Adam, but just believe things about me and will cuss me out in the middle of the streets, tell me I'm just like every other politician, and it's hard to work through that. So I'm hoping that that there's an old saying that says, "Who you are speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you say." And I'm thinking that the earnestness and the authenticness of our efforts will ultimately win allies. But we've also got to find better ways of communicating that to people. And even the story of the previous mayor who casted a lot of suspicion on me that I was this outsider, that I did have nefarious means, and that's still a strong sentiment out there. This story that he was in office for 20-something years and didn't do minority set-asides, didn't do this, didn't do that. We've got to find ways to tell that story. But this is the difficult thing, and I'll impress upon you as a Newarker, and I'll sort of, as I come to an end, is, we've got this huge budget deficit, and it might end up with us laying off hundreds and hundreds of workers. Now, in many ways, our bureaucracy's grown bloated and might be able to do without hundreds and hundreds of workers, and we're doing that analysis now to find the best way out of this. But that could play into a lot of the cynicism in the community. Here, he comes into office, and the first thing he does is fire 250 African Americans from our community from City Hall. And so this is the difficult thing, I think, being about public leadership, is always trying to be, it's the poetry and it's the prose, always trying to get the pragmatic plans and solutions right. But the poetry is so important. You've got to have, and I aspire to be this kind of leader that has a way of communicating to the highest aspirations and to the imagination, the moral imagination of their residents, to be able to articulate a vision that is so compelling that it rises all of us up. But not only that, it also inspires in us not to just follow, but to be leaders ourselves. And I think Newark is in that critical change. We can become an international city. We can become a city that's vibrant and strong, but we have to be able to see ourselves that way. It all returns to what Mrs. Jones was talking about, is how do we see our own community, how do we see ourselves? Do we have what is the most important quest I have in my life, is a true, strong self-love that is not marked by hubris, it's not marked by demagoguery, but it's marked by a consistent atonement to your possibilities and to your potential. And I think Newark has a chance to claim for itself that kind of self-love. And as a result of claiming that, I think we're going to create a light and energy that's going to cast away darkness even in the shadows that other cities are experiencing.
Corey, would that more American politicians were as grounded as you. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Cory Booker, the mayor of Newark. Now, and I can tell from your response, which is the same as mine, that many of you are going to come up and ask how you can help. And I'm hungry, and I know he's hungry, so I don't want all that. So what we want to know is where they can email you or, and save your resumes. This is a Kennedy School, man. These people like jackals. They'll be up here getting jobs and everything else. So tell them how to reach you through the mail so we don't have to go through that.
Yeah, you can email me at cbooker@bookerteam.com. You could attack Barry if you want. Yeah, I've got some cards here in my pocket that I'll give out to the first come, first serve. But
that's great.
Yeah.
Right here, raise your hand. Blonde hair, black suit, and a wonderful person. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks. Thank you, buddy.